Professor Guzzini, constructivism is probably one of the most difficult IR theories to understand. How would you briefly define constructivism?
I don't think it's that difficult, but it depends on how you conceive of theories. If theories are ready-made instruments to be used for policy making, then constructivism is usually not on that level. It's on the level of the observer. It looks at the international system as if you were looking at a zoo, so to speak. And there it is interested in the way knowledge that is socially constructed interacts with that social reality which is based on the shared beliefs we have about it. Now, that doesn't mean that material factors don't come in. They do come in. It doesn't mean that therefore the world will be very peaceful or whatever. Quite to the contrary, constructivists are extremely, these days I believe at least, extremely nervous about international affairs exactly for these kind of struggles of recognition, struggles of identity, clashes. But it is therefore not to be seen as a clear policy advice theory. It's rather seen on the level of the observer to see how things run. And the connection is sometimes a little bit more complicated than it is with some other theories. But even realism tried to become very observer-oriented rather than being just the policy advice.
What are some of the other criticisms of constructivism?
I think the difficulty with constructivism, or there are many, as a scientist, I think the major trouble is the empirical use of it. Not that it cannot be used, but just the difficulty of it. Because the type of methodologies you might need are informed by linguistics for discourse analysis, might be informed by ethnography for the more, for the participant observation type of analysis. And it will be informed by historical methods, or as I mentioned in the talk, causal mechanisms, which are perhaps not the typical efficient causality, but the type of more contingent causality used by some sociologists or historians, which make the analysis, I think, relatively rich empirically, but also at the same time relatively difficult. And they are falsifiable, just as any historical analysis is also falsifiable, perhaps not in times of a testing, but in times of the control of the evidence and in the argument. But the argument is not always necessarily easy to be produced. Many constructivists have become more of a historian over time for that as well.
Lastly, Professor Guzzini, how does constructivism differ from realism?
Well, it differs in its ontology, i.e. that it usually assumes a more ideational ontology than realists usually do. It also thinks that rationalism being right is not sufficient for the explanation, so that most of the important components come before the rational analysis, namely in how interests are formed in the first place. Rationalism is normally based upon self-interest, but interest then is given or taken constant, whereas constructivists very often problematize where these interests come from and whether they stay constant over time in the analysis.
Thank you very much, Professor Guzzini.
Welcome.